I've had difficulty putting these slides together, and this still is going to be a work in progress as I present because this is a really difficult question to answer if you're not a clinician and you've not tried to use clinical data sets. Um, my history with CBTN, formerly CBTTC, and actually my academic career history has been addressing unmet needs. So I spent about a decade in the lab. And what I keep going back to though is our clinical research how to do clinical research in a way that does not rely on the traditional methodologies. Um, for disclosures, I do sit on 2 scientific advisory boards. So for those of you who don't know, who are not clinicians and don't know how clinical data is collected, the traditional way, and even in clinical trials, we rely on young professionals, people oftentimes just out of medical school, to read through clinical charts and abstract that information and manually enter it into a different platform. And that has been the basis of a lot of clinical data provided for research through the past decades. So what Adam was describing is something called FHIR, which is an interface. So it's not to solve the problem. And it's almost, if you want to think about it with your iPhone versus your Android, as Sarah pointed out, just a decade ago is when we all started to use smartphones. And smartphones don't talk to each other. So FHIR is going to be important, but it's not going to fix or solve the problem. And this is one of the reasons why. There is so much rich data. And so with 2021, as of April 2021, the federal government mandated if you've ever seen a doctor, you can have access to your own clinical records. I would encourage anyone in the room who has not tried to go into their online portals to look to see how things are documented. So this is one slide to describe something complex, which is in the past decade, we've gone from medical documentation and ordering from paper records into hybrid electronic portals. And so now the 2 major electronic health record systems are Cerner and Epic. Those 2 systems do not talk to each other. And so even within CBTN, we're having to use different electronic health records. So even for mapping to try and get information in the same format out of the 2 is going to be a huge heavy lift. That also does not include the data that we generate from the images, from the laboratory records. Even vital signs can be difficult to capture because in one system, it may be referred to as blood pressure, and another systolic blood pressure, and another, just BP. And so behind the scenes, we have to take in clinically, and when we're looking at it, we know what those numbers mean, but you have to do this within a technology platform or system. This is why, in my opinion, this is the hardest data to capture and to curate. And this is why Google, Amazon, IBM Watson, they have all tried and no one has come up with a solution yet. So when I was putting these slides together, I wanted to take us a walk through the past to show us where we're going in the future. So in 2012, I naively said, yes, I will help what was then known as Children's Brain Tumor Tissue Consortium because I was doing genomic discovery in the lab and it just made sense as a clinician who was involved in biospecimens that, of course, I can help with clinical data. So this is the original clinical reporting form that I was handed to kind of review and annotate. So the notes on these are my handwritten notes. And there were just some things that I didn't know. I had not done clinical research myself. I didn't know database science. But there were just some obvious things as I was looking through it, which is, why do we care when the date the form was captured? Don't we really want to know the date of diagnosis? Do we care what age the patient was when the coordinator entered this data? And so there were just some simple things moving from free text to drop-down options to standardize. At the time, I didn't have the language to try and describe what I was trying to help create, which was clinical data standards to make the data going in more uniform and the data coming out more easy to interpret. And so back in, I think, 2015, let me fast forward here. So to fast forward from 2012, when I initially said, yes, I'll help, to not recognizing what I was getting myself involved in, to 2015, which was our first investigator meeting. This was held in Philadelphia, and it was the first time we brought the multiple institutions together. The next set of slides are are actually slides that I presented at that meeting talking about clinical data. So here, like, this seems really, really straightforward. This is the data that we want to capture to be able to annotate with the specimens. Seems pretty logical, pretty straightforward. It is not. Oh, two additional comments that I didn't include in my slides, and I don't think we've talked about today either in terms of clinical data. Because of HIPAA and privacy, and also because of federal and state regulations, our clinical data is more heavily protected. And so there are certain regulations and things that we have to abide by. This is where CBTN and the master agreement and how we're sharing data back when this started is actually transformational, because we created a system where we can go back and forth into records. Even if we don't know what clinical questions and data that we should have captured, we still have the ability from a regulatory standpoint, and this is key, to go back to sites and go back to the source data. So back in 2015, when I was standing in front of a much smaller group, I described the clinical data challenges are data completion. This is still a problem. This is where REDCap will be transformational for us, because right now coordinators aren't, it's not clear for the coordinators entering the data when their records are complete. REDCap will change that. Standardization of data across multiple institutions. If you were to take a patient with a high-grade glioma and look at the clinical notes and documentation across 10 different institutions, a lot of it would look similar, but maybe not. So some of the crucial details will be in there, but it's not going to be as easy to pull out because most of the data is in free text form. And so back in 2015, and I don't know if Brian and Sarah remember, I then captured you guys into a separate small room to help develop what would be the first set of kind of CBTN clinical data standards. But we created a data dictionary, which should be step one. And then we created some rules. And the first one was, we decided the neuro-oncology note was going to be the source of truth or the source of record. And so that should be where the coordinators are primarily gathering their information. And the reason for this is, if you were to look at the surgery note versus the MRI note versus multiple other sources, something as simple as what extent of tumor was resected may not be consistent or clear. So we said the source of truth should be the neuro-oncologist who's developing the treatment plan. So that was something that seemed common sense, but I recognize in retrospect, that kind of data standard hadn't been established before. And so I think, there's many good aspects of the data that has been entered, but we still, as Sarah pointed out, we are still focused on making sure that the data that goes in is standardized and the data that comes out is standardized. So in 2015, I realized now how naive I was in saying that if we can just get clinicians to standardize how we put data into the electronic health record, problem solved. Yes. So there are a group of us, and what I didn't realize when I made these statements in 2015, that this would lead me out of the laboratory. It would lead me to go to Epic on site, get builder certification, figure out how Epic actually works, to potentially sit for the clinical informatics boards to understand how our notes are written, how the data is curated, and then also go back to school. And I'm now about to finish up a master's in healthcare analytics. So this is not easy. So I'm going to bring this back to an analogy, and hopefully this will make sense to people because it was highly entertaining to myself when I put this together last night. So in my healthcare analytics leadership class, this swing analogy, which I had never seen before, was presented. So if we go back to 2015 or 2012 and 2015, this is what we thought we wanted. Clearly, you can see some issues with this. Why does this wing have 3 different ladders? How does one sit on it? Who sits on it? So that was what the clinical team stated we wanted. This is how the project team understood what the ask was. And then this is how the programmer who designed the BRP developed it. And this is where, in many respects, it is what was asked for, but to the clinician who's looking at the data coming out, there's an obvious issue with this. And then ultimately, and this is where we are really focused on, we've realized that the data we provided to the investigators was how we understood it and is not sufficient. So for anyone who's already requested data, do know that there are updated data queries that we can perform for you, and that another key issue or aspect is not everyone wants the data in the same format. And so if you are, an individual clinician wanting to look at 10 patients versus someone from the biology side wanting to pair outcomes with your genomic analysis versus someone who says, I want to look at the big data analytics. I want all 5,000 cases and I want every single piece of data that you have available. Those are 3 different formats. And that's something that Sarah and I in the clinical data working group have really identified and are trying to tackle. So at the end, though, in 2015, as we were going through this is how we actually thought we were providing the data. And this is how Adam would have described us of how we were providing the data. So it's clear that we still have work to do. And as a clinician and as someone who's been in the lab, I will say the clinical data in many respects is going to be the hardest data to do well and to match with the specimens, because at the end of the day, we don't always know how we should build something. And so in 2012, this is what we thought we wanted to build. In 2022, this is what we think we actually need, but we're going to need to go back to this drawing board and take a look at this again, and especially go back and look at the data science aspect, because how things are built, you need to go back and look and make sure that you're not missing, half the tree that the support stands on. So just to wrap this up in terms of, it's not just pediatric neuro-oncology, all of pediatric oncology, and this has been the fun part of me of working with Sam's group at the PCDC, data standards are actually lacking across healthcare and are lacking in pediatric oncology. And so, when we're talking about data standards, it's something as simple as, do you call something a low-grade glioma? Do you do LGG as this description? Or do you say WHO low-grade glioma? Or do you say WHO2 low-grade glioma? Do you lump those? Do you split those? It's still the same diagnosis, but it can have 5 or 6 different names. So how do you capture and how do you create a data standard for that? How is the data represented, stored, and transferred from the EHR into the data platform? And then how can we take the clinical trial data, and Sam, I think we'll go into this a little bit, but I think where we've really pushed his team with the PCDC is we're not taking only clinical trial data, which goes through one treatment and has specific CRFs or reporting forms. We're trying to merge that with real world data. So this is something that no one's really quite done before to the extent that we're trying to do. And I do think that it can be impactful. And as Sarah pointed out, that's been what's missing. We not only want to know what your biology is and if you lived or you died, we want to know what treatments you got, what toxicities you got, how you did during that journey, and maybe be able to understand and develop better treatments that way. So this is just a shout out to the pediatric oncologists who are working together right now. We're a small working group that kind of came out of some of these discussions. What you'll note too on here is I'm the only neuro-oncologist in this group. So this is one too of making sure that as we're developing pediatric oncology standards, that neuro-onc has a seat at the table. In many ways, I think our data is going to be the most complex because the WHO CNS classification has changed dramatically over the past decade. And this has been something that's been really challenging for us as clinicians to try and interpret. We have new diagnoses that did not exist 10 years ago. The tumors existed, but what we called them did not exist. And so trying to make sense of all of that. And so for this pediatric oncology standard working group, our call to action are really to create common data models to support data standards, and then also to try and standardize and incorporate. So part of the treatment data and why it's so difficult to gather is it's not easy to find and it's not represented the same across the medical systems. So if you want to know if someone actually got the full treatment and if they had a dose reduction or something happened, that's much more difficult data to tease out in a real world setting. And then another big mandate that we've been talking about is the power of going back to the vendors we use. The vendors we use, Epic and Cerner, and that's what the majority of the pediatric institutions use, are not motivated to develop things for pediatric patients. Everything, most of the foundational layer, at least for Epic, is based on adult workflows. And so one of the things we're also going back to look at is to see if we can standardize or come to some kind of consensus of how we want certain data to be represented within the EHR, and go back to the vendors and ask them to build it in the foundational layer that is pushed out to all of the institutions, rather than relying on each individual institution having to recode or reprogram or modify it per their own institution, because then we run into problems where how CHOP does it may not be how Children's National does it, may not be how Lurie does it. So I think those are kind of, they're more complex than what may seem obvious at first blush. So hopefully I've kind of brought this all home, in which, yes, as Adam points out, CBTN is a federated consortium. We've moved from being tissue to a network. And the reason I personally wanted to remove tissue from our name was tissue alone, biology alone is not going to help us be transformational. It's not going to help us to get to our mission, which is we need better therapies and we need to know which patients will benefit